For over a decade, this man broke into homes across California, terrorized families, and vanished without a trace. No fingerprints, no name, and for 40 years, nobody caught him. The phone rang at 2 in the morning, years after the crimes, in the middle of the night. She picked it up. Then, after a silence that felt like forever, he spoke.
Remember me.
And the line went dead. That call came years after he had broken into her home, years after her family had tried to move on. He had a new life, new neighbors, a quiet street, a normal name. And he still called because he needed her to know one thing. He had never left. He sat in the same room as the men hunting him. He was a cop the entire time. And every night, he went back to the shadows to hunt for his next victim. To understand how the Golden State Killer evaded detection for 40 years, you have to start with one fact that changes everything. He was a cop. When these crimes began, DeAngelo was still on the force. Even after he was removed from the job, he carried that insider knowledge with him for every year that followed. The training didn't leave when the badge did. Picture a detective walking into a briefing room, photographs on the board, evidence maps on the table, a case that has gone nowhere for months. The lead investigator starts talking, reads out the suspect profile, describes the pattern of crimes, explains why this person is so impossible to find, and somewhere in that room, one person already knows every single answer, because that person is the suspect. That was not a movie plot. That was Joseph James DeAngelo's working life. By day, he swore an oath to protect the people of this city. By night, he mocked that oath while selecting his next target. When his colleagues sat around with their coffee, asking each other how to catch this monster, he sat right there with them, nodding along. This was not simply hiding. This was the most contemptible betrayal of the badge imaginable. DeAngelo served as a police officer in California starting in the early 1970s. He sat in those rooms. He learned exactly how crime scenes were processed, where the gaps in jurisdiction created blind spots no single agency could cover, and what made investigators miss things they were looking directly at. He did not guess at these things. He was trained in them. He used that training as a shield every single time. Other criminals leave traces because they do not fully understand what investigators look for. DeAngelo had been in those rooms. He knew exactly what they looked for, which meant he knew precisely what not to leave behind. For 40 years, he was winning, and the people trying to stop him had no idea they were playing against someone who had already read their playbook cover to cover. DeAngelo didn't guess which window the victims forgot to lock that night. He already knew. Days before each intrusion, DeAngelo had already been inside that home. No crime committed, nothing taken. He walked the floor plan, memorized the layout, located where things were kept, and sometimes moved an object just slightly. Just enough that residents might sense something felt different the next morning, but not enough to say what. And then came the night he had been preparing for. When he returned, he came in the hours before dawn, when sleep is deepest, when the body is slowest. No one in that house could call for help. No one could escape. This was not chance. It was the result of careful, deliberate preparation, and he knew it. He did not leave immediately. He stayed. He moved through the house like he owned it. He ate food from the refrigerator, unhurried, completely at ease, in a home that was not his. But here's where it gets even worse. DeAngelo would place ordinary household dishes on their backs, a silent alarm of his own design. Any movement, and the sound would give them away. They were not controlled only by force. They were frozen by the sound any little movement might make. DeAngelo was not improvising. He was running a system he had designed before he ever walked through the door. And then came the phone calls. Months later, sometimes years. DeAngelo would dial a number he had never forgotten, wait for a voice he recognized, and say nothing. No words, just slow, deliberate breathing. Because he needed victims to understand, leaving that house had ended nothing. DeAngelo knew their homes. The victims didn't know him, and that gap was something he had built deliberately and maintained for over a decade. Here is the question that went unanswered for 40 years. Not where DeAngelo was. Investigators suspected the geography, not what he looked like. They had descriptions. The question was this: how do you catch someone who already knows exactly what you are going to do before you do it? Someone who had sat in your briefing rooms, used your procedures, understood your system from the inside out? For 40 years, nobody had an answer. DeAngelo was counting on that. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He didn't even know they were getting closer, and they were getting closer. A distant relative of DeAngelo, with no connection to any crime, had uploaded their own genetic data to a public genealogy site. An ordinary thing millions of people do to find cousins they never knew existed. They had no idea what chain they had just started. One name surfaced, then stayed. A name that matched the geography, the timeline, the profile of someone who had spent decades making sure the system could never reach him. Before saying a word outside the task force, investigators needed confirmation. They waited, watched his routine. And on a day DeAngelo discarded something in a publicly accessible space, they collected it. One sample, one lab result. A perfect match. He had planned for everything. Every escape route, every possible threat, every detail of every scenario. He had spent decades making sure the system could never touch him. The morning that match came back, the hunters finally knew exactly where to go. Citrus Heights, California. Before sunrise, every exit blocked, every angle covered. Before he even touched the door handle, Joseph James DeAngelo stepped out of his quiet suburban home to take out the trash. Same routine, same neighborhood. The retired man on the corner doing exactly what retired men do on ordinary mornings. The street was not empty. They knew exactly who he was, a man who had spent decades studying their own rule book. They were not giving him one final move, not one.
Joseph James DeAngelo.
40 years he had nowhere to go, no plan, no exit, no countermove. Just a trash bag in his hands and agents closing in from every direction. No chase, no struggle, just handcuffs. And 40 years of terror over. The predator was in a cage, and he would never leave it. 2 years later, Sacramento. DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair at the front of the courtroom, slumped, stone-faced, 74 years old. He stared at nothing. The judge listed the charges: 13 counts of first-degree murder, dozens of additional charges, a list that took minutes to read aloud. When it was done, the room went still.
How do you plead?
He whispered so quietly the judge had to lean forward.
Guilty.
The man who had once breathed into the phone just to remind his victims he was still out there could barely produce sound in that room. The power had shifted completely. Then the survivors stood up, one by one. They had waded through decades of sleepless nights, locked doors, and lights left burning until sunrise. And now they had the floor, and he had to sit there and listen. There was nothing else he could do. The man who had controlled every room he ever entered could not leave this one. One survivor looked directly at him, no hesitation, no tears, and said,
"Saying the coward who victimized me. Well, I am here. I am free to leave this courtroom and lead the life I choose. You are going to spend the rest of your life in the company, just as he will be forgotten, and eventually inside the confines of the California Department of Corrections."
DeAngelo sat in silence the entire time. The same silence he had once forced on others. The ones who were once bound and helpless were now standing, and he was the one who could not move. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole, ever. He will die in prison. The pension he had collected for decades, stripped entirely. The badge that had protected him for decades became part of the evidence against him. The system he had used as a shield had become the cage. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had terrorized an entire state for 4 decades. Those hands were still, and they would stay that way for the rest of his life. Here is the detail most people never hear. After the arrest, investigators went back through decades of official records tied to the Golden State Killer cases. And there, across multiple documents, they found his name, his badge number, his signature. On paperwork connected to the very investigations built around finding him. He hadn't just hidden in plain sight. At certain points, he was a documented participant in the official effort to catch himself. One question before you go. 11 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole, ever. He will die behind those walls. Does that feel like enough for 40 years of terror? Tell me in the comments. Don't miss out on the next content. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications.